Hi, Dave Scotland for AE Tuts, and welcome to Chapter 1 of our 10-part series, Nuke in Production. And today we're going to really get started in Nuke by having a look at some of the interface features. And this is by no means a definitive look at the interface, and I do suggest that there's some great material at the Foundry website. But I really wanted to cover some of the main areas and really give you some of the areas that you can definitely start playing with and introduce you to some of the things that we're going to be using quite a lot over the next 10 episodes of the series. So let's get started. So first of all, before we start having a look at the user interface, it's important to understand where Nuke fits on the landscape and what exactly Nuke is relative to something that we do know, and that is some of the more common or popular software out there like After Effects or Photoshop. Now, if we were to have a look at Photoshop, we could see that here we have a layer, and I can duplicate that layer a couple of times, and I have multiple layers, but I've also got up here a history, and in this history is all of the things that I've done to this layer or these layers. So I could take this top layer, I could use my erase tool, just isolate that and just start erasing things out, and you can see that I'm actually adding to the history. Now there's a finite amount of history entries that are possible here, and that of course is relative to your preferences in Photoshop. But it's the architecture, it's the scenario that this is built on, this history-based scenario and the layer-based scenario, that makes it a little bit different from Nuke. In fact, a lot different from Nuke. And if I wanted to come back up and say delete layer up in here, I'm actually getting rid of quite a lot of the work. Say I've got this hue and saturation up in here. I can go back to a previous state of the file in the history, but a lot of the work I've done since that hue and saturation is still, I have to sieve my way through here. And unfortunately, one of the biggest problems is if I save this and try to come back into it, this history is gone. And there are certain things that I can do to sort of help me in that process, but it is one of the major areas that is different from Nuke. So it's this layer-based and history-based way of working that's very, very different from Nuke. Now, if we have a look at Nuke, where we've got the same image here, I can add a saturation node, and I can bring up that saturation and fine-tune some of the saturation out of that image, and then I can put a color correction, a grade node on it, and multiply it down, maybe gain it up a little bit, gamma it down. And then I could maybe put a blur on the bottom and just bring up those properties there, and then really crank the blur. Now, what I can actually do is go back to my saturation and fine tune the saturation here, no problems, without adding an extra saturation. I could even turn it off and everything else stays. I can turn the saturation back on, turn the blur layer off and the grade layer off. I can turn the grade layer on, manipulate it, and see what it looks like, and then put the blur back on. And all of this is done without using that history-based scenario. And it's very non-linear, and it allows me to jump in and jump out and make changes. I can duplicate these things, I can copy them around, and that really is one of the major differences between After Effects and Photoshop and Nuke. So it's the fact that it's not a layer-based and it's not a linear or history-based environment that is really one of the major differences that Nuke has. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got our interface, and in our interface, it's basically made up of, let me just close some of these down. It's made up of 4 main sections. One is the properties bin on the far right here. One is the viewer bin or pane. And then we've got our toolbar down the side. And then down the bottom here, we have our node graph. Now, hidden with our node graph here is a couple of other tabs, which we're going to get to when we explore a little bit of animation in coming chapters. But we've got our curve editor and our dope sheet. But for now, we're just going to concentrate on the node graph as far as this pane is concerned down the bottom here. Now, the node graph is a huge palette. It's massive, and you can navigate around. In fact, if there are objects off the edge, it gives us this little window here, and we can actually navigate those sections back into our view. We'll get to that a little bit later. So let's leave the node graph for now and just have a little bit of a look at our viewer. This is our viewer window up here, and it has a timeline down the bottom. At the moment, because this is a still image, it's only giving me one frame on the timeline, but if I put this to, instead of input, put it to global, it will inherit the global setting for the timeline, which currently is set to 125 frames, and I would be able to play using these controls here my footage if it was in fact footage rather than a still. So as I just mentioned, you've got global and input for changing the way we look at the timeline. We can also hold control and bring in these brackets here and actually just render that little section or play back that little section there, which is very handy if you just want to look at an isolated section of your timeline. So I'm just holding control to bring those back. Pull this back to 0 again. We've got the next section that I want to jump to is these properties bin over here, because I want to use the properties bin to show you something that should be checked whenever you start a session in Nuke, and that is your project settings. Now, if you hit S anywhere in the curve in the node graph down here, or you can come up and go Edit Project Settings, it will bring up this window here, and in here we can set our lookup table or our LUT, and we're going to get to have a bit of a look at that in a future chapter. But what's important for us is in this root tab to make sure that our full size format is actually set correctly. Now, by default, when you jump into Nuke for the first time or any time, this is not set to this 720 default. In fact, this is something that I created a little earlier. By default, it will be set to, I believe it's 2K Super 35, and that will be the default output. And so, say for instance, and don't panic, I'm going to get to what I'm doing down here, but I'm just going to throw a constant in for a second just to show you what this means. If I change this constant to a different color so we can see what we're doing. So I've just got a red constant here. For you After Effects users, it's similar to a solid, a red solid. But have a look at the actual resolution that constant has been created at, which is this 2K Super. So the format, the actual full-size format of my comp is going to drive a lot of this creation process as I create various nodes down here. It's actually going to create this format as the size of this node and many other nodes as I go along. Now, this can be very, very problematic, and there's really no point in this being at 2K if my output for this project is say 720 HD, something like that. So what I like to do is, if it doesn't exist in here, then I can go down and just go new and type in whatever resolution I want to make this preset. So just go 720 and pixel aspect 1, that's no problems. I'm just going to call this 720, and I might put a tab in this one because I've already got a 720 HD one there. I'm just going to go OK, and now in the list you'll see that I have that 720 tab HD, and if I click on that, notice the constant has now inherited that size, because if I double click the constant up here, you can see that it is set to be the root format, and the root format we have just set. The other thing you'll notice is by default Nuke will always revert to 24 frames per second when you open it up, and for those of you in different zones in the world, you may just need to get used to having to change this if you are working in the other formats. For me, I'm from Australia, so we use 25 frames per second for a lot of our TV, for TV commercials and TV content. So I spend a lot of time in 25, but as long as you know that that is always 24 by default, then you'll always jump in here. The thing is, always make sure you jump into your project settings and do this process before you start doing anything in Nuke. So I'll just delete this, and I'm just going to pull this back up again, and we'll continue on. So I've got my node graph down here, I've got my viewer, and I've got my project settings, and I've got my tools. Now if you look at your tools over here, they're organized into a common sense order as far as grouping tools together. I've got image, draw, time, channel, color, and if you click on these, you'll see that they're made up of all the tools that are relating to color, and some of them actually have some subheadings as well. Now, those After Effects users amongst us will definitely be familiar with this process, because it's very similar to the effects menu that exists in After Effects. And so this is where we store all of our tools. Now, you may be missing a couple of these ones down the bottom. There's some plugins that I've installed, and also Nuke has the ability to do some gizmos and tools, which I'll get to in a future episode as well. So don't panic if you don't have all of these icons in your interface. So I'm just going to close this down over here. Now, the other thing worth having a look at as well is that we have a menu bar up here, and I did mention it earlier with the project settings. So the thing to remember with Nuke is that there are usually a couple of different ways to get things working, and the best example I can give you is the tools that we have here. Notice up here, this is my image tools, and if I click on that, I've got read, and we use this quite a bit, and that's the reason why it actually has a hotkey listed here. Anything that gets used quite a lot in Nuke seems to have a hotkey listed in the menus, and R is the hotkey. So if I click on that, it pops up this window, and it's asking me to locate some assets or some video assets, and here we are with a JPEG sequence, and I'll get to this read process later on. I'm just going to go OK. Now, that allowed me to read in this asset, but I could have right-clicked down here in the node graph to bring up this, and if I go image, read, I could do the same thing, read it in again, no problems, and I could also hit R for the shortcut, and there it is again. And one last one is the tab function. Now, this is the one I use the most. So over the next 10 lessons, you will see me using the tab function to create a lot of my nodes. Now, the time you spend with Nuke, you will start to recognize or learn the names of a lot of the tools, and that's where this tab menu becomes more and more useful. If I hit tab, it brings this up and I can start typing. Now, if I type R, it'll start shortening this list. So there's read at the top, but if I go R-E, A, it starts shortening until ultimately it gets to the actual one that I need, and I can bring it up. So there was 4 radically different ways to do exactly the same thing in Nuke, and those of you familiar with After Effects are very familiar with that process as well, that there are usually multiple ways to do the same thing in After Effects, especially when it comes to effects. So the other thing you've seen me do a couple of times is wire my viewer to what I'm doing, and I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail shortly. So for now, I'm just going to wire this back to this and get rid of these here and just have this here. So okay, so the next thing I wanted to quickly touch on is the ability to customize the interface. So a lot of you will be through various other applications be familiar with a context sensitive mouse. When I roll over something and it allows me to do something else, the mouse will change, and you can notice here that I can change the size of these panes, and really like if I double click and bring up that read node, I can squash this over considerably. You do have to be careful. If you squash it over too much, eventually it will cut into the data, and sometimes it's not quite as obvious as you would think that certain data is missing when you do that. But you can also drag these panels around a little bit. So I could pull this panel down and maybe dock it down the bottom here. So I've got my node graph and I've got my properties on the same panel. I could maybe grab my node graph and drop it up here on this pane. Now, what you can actually do is delete or close. We're not deleting, but we're closing these tabs. So I'm closing all of these tabs, and if you ever find yourself in this situation where everything's gone missing, and you can actually go into the panes as well. See these little pane here, these pane menus? You can go into here and go close pane, and you can go up here as well, close pane and close pane. And what you're actually left with is nothing. There's nothing there except for my toolbar, and I can actually, if I just put my mouse in the right spot, I can actually close this hidden pane here. Close pane, and I've got nothing left there at all. And if this ever happens and you're not happy with, or you can't work out exactly what's going on there, the easiest thing to do is come straight up here to your layout, and then restore layout. Now in this menu you can actually save layouts as well. So if you're used to using 2 monitors, but then sometimes you're using 1 for any reason, you can save different layouts, or you can save different layouts relative to different jobs that you're doing, different tasks within the environment. So I'm just going to restore layout, and that allows me to come back to a default state. So I'm just going to resize this for a sec. There we go. Now everything's missing because I need to bring up my viewer, so I'm just going to do that over here, and in a moment I'll give you a rundown of how that viewer works. So now I'm back to where I was before. Everything's exactly where it should be, and I've got all my tabs exactly where they are relative to the startup file that ships with Nuke. Now if we look up here in a little bit more detail, let's have a look at the viewer up here. I'm going to skip over these 2 sections over on the left because we're going to look at those in a lot more detail in an upcoming lesson when we're going to cover some channel stuff. But the basic channels that are available to us are listed here. There's R, G, B, and A, or red, green, blue, and alpha. But there's a matte, overlay visibility, and a luminance visibility as well. So if we have a look at luminance, this is the luminance of the image that we just happen to be looking at the moment. And I can use the hotkeys, red, green, blue, and alpha, R, G, B, and A. And these are toggles. So if I want to look at the red channel, I can hit R for red, B for blue, G for green, and A for alpha. And if I hit A again, it'll come back to RGB. So if I hit R for red and then R for red again, it'll come back. So these are toggles, B for blue again, it'll come back again. And you can always use this drop down menu as well. Just below there, you'll see that I actually have 2 sliders. One is for gain and one is for gamma. And just while we're on it as well, if you hold your mouse for long enough on anything, you'll get this little tooltips. And these tooltips are extremely valuable when you're starting out in Nuke, and even when you've been using it for a while. These tooltips can be very, very valuable at giving you a quick refresher of what's going on for that particular tool. So this one's gamma, and if I gamma down, you'll notice this turns red, and if I gamma up, that gives me the full extent of gamma available in this session. And if I hit the red Y, it will return back to its natural position, which is gamma of 1. And so too over here, I've got my gain. So I can gain it down and I can gain it up. And over here, as I gain it, this is actually giving you an f-stop reading, which for those photographically minded people out there, this is extremely valuable. And it allows you to see what a shot is like if you increase it by a stop or decrease it by a stop. And this is very valuable for color correction later on and for various functions. So we're going to be using this later on in future episodes. Once again, hit the red number and it will reset to where it is. We'll discuss this later on. This is a great feature of wiping in between two versions of the same file. And when I've got an example to show you, we'll show you that. I use that quite a lot. Over here on the right, at the moment, we are looking at the regular size of the image divided by 1.4. But if I put that at times 1, this is the actual real size of the image. And when that says times 1, we're looking at the actual size of the image relative to the pixels available in our screen resolution. And if I went, say, divided by 2, that's half size. Divided by 4, quarter size, and so on. Now, times means I can see it 2 times size, 6 times size, and so on. So that's basic. And if I use my middle mouse button to wind in and out, this actually updates and can show me what level of magnification I'm at. Now, just next to that is where we toggle between 2D and 3D and all of our various isometric views, top view, left view, and so on. Later on when we get into 3D, I'm going to go into this stuff in detail because it's invaluable, but just quickly, if I click 3D, you'll see that this is actually a 3D environment. Now, while we're on that, After Effects is a 2.5D environment application where you have a 3D universe, but you don't have geometry without plugins. So everything is flat in After Effects. It allows you to have cameras and lights and null objects and layers, flat layers, but without plugins, that's as far as it goes, and that's why it's termed as a 2.5D environment. Now, Nuke is a true 3D environment. It actually allows for geometry. So you can actually have geometry with polygons, vertices, those sorts of things, with UVW mapping and projection. And that's why, it's one of the reasons why Nuke is so popular in production at the moment, is it's a true 3D environment and can talk beautifully with 3D applications. And some of the stuff that's being done in Nuke at the moment is quite astounding in that 3D environment. So we're going to get to that in a couple of the future lessons. Everything else here is, we're going to go into it in more detail. Probably, we'll just go back to a 2D shot. This one here is it's a region of interest. And if I was to put, say, a blur node and crank the blur, then basically it's only going to blur inside that region of interest. So the region of interest is a great way to just isolate a certain part of your image, especially when it's taking a long time to render. So this allows me to just have a look at my region of interest in here. This one here forces a render. Sometimes the render doesn't run automatically, and it depends on what I'm doing, but I can force it to render, and it will just do a scanline render of my image. We'll get to that a little bit later on in more detail with some practical examples. This one here is your color space that's currently being used, and by default it's set to sRGB. So the default color space in Nuke is sRGB out of the box. But you'll see over the next couple of lessons that we aren't always given sRGB footage. In fact, this footage is not sRGB. It is sRGB color space, but when it came in, it wasn't. It was set to linear, and that is not how I rendered this out of Max. In fact, sRGB is how it was rendered, and to be more specific, it was rendered at a gamma 2.2, and in that color space, reading it as sRGB, it's perfectly matching what came out of 3D Studio Max. So if I just put that to the correct color space. So we're going to cover that in a lot more detail up in here. And now I'm just going to come down into the node graph and give you a little bit of a heads up at how this all works. I'm just going to delete this node over here. And to delete a node, you just highlight it and then select delete on your keyboard. And I'm just going to bring the viewer over here, and I've got some footage. Now, you'll notice up here, I can't see anything. And the reason for that is that the viewer, which is a node, and if I delete the viewer, notice everything's gone missing up here, because what we were looking at was the actual viewer and all of the settings that are associated with that viewer. So to bring the viewer back, so I can right click down here in the node graph, and it's in image and viewer. I can also use the image up the top here and viewer as well. So I've brought my viewer back, and here it is, but it's not plugged into anything, and that's why I can't see anything. Now, to plug in the viewer to an image, I can click this arrow, click and drag, and plug it in to my image, or I can take the arrow at the bottom of the image and plug it into my viewer. It works both ways, and it's up to you which way you use it. The other alternative is to grab the image or highlight the image node or the read node and then hit 1. Every viewer has multiple inputs, and they're listed as 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So I could actually take this read node and hit 2. This one 3, this one 4. And now as I toggle using my numbers on my keyboard, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm able to toggle back and forward amongst all those images. I could take this one and go 5, this one 6, and so now I can actually view anything I want through that viewer. It's not recommended that you use so many different viewers, because it becomes extremely confusing, and I tend to only use maybe 2 at the most. I'd use 2 because it allows me to compare really nicely. So I could have this checkerboard here, and I could maybe select this one, maybe go 2. So I've got 1 and 2. I could come up into here and go wipe, and you'll see now I have a wipe where I've got my checkerboard on the right. You can see here it says checkerboard, which is piped into my view 1, and over here I've got my read 3, which is this ASX over here, and that allows me to wipe. I can rotate this around to wipe any direction I want, and I can also do a sort of a half transparent wipe as well. Now I use this a lot. You can do a minus, under, and over, and we can get rid of it altogether. So I use that a lot, and I'll be showing you that in production processes later on. So I'm just going to disconnect this and go back to my number one. And like I said before, you can just join it up like this. The other thing to remember about viewers is you can have multiple viewers. I could just click over here, go into my image and bring up another viewer. So I now have two viewers, and I could put this one on the ASX model. And notice I've got two tabs up here now. So I could grab that one and move it over into this tab over here, or I could right click or bring up the pane menu and do a split horizontal, and that brings up this extra space, and I can now drag my viewer into there, and that I now have two viewers that is completely visible, and I can, with two timelines, and I'm moving through time on both, but I'm seeing two different products, one piped into viewer 1 and one piped into viewer 2. So I'll just get rid of that. So I'll undock that viewer, and I'll close this pane just to bring this back to what we had before. The next thing I want to have a look at is how these nodes work. So what you're looking at here is I've got 3 read nodes, and I mentioned before read nodes are how we get footage into Nuke. If I hit R, which is the shortcut key, it brings up this window, and I can navigate to an image or an image sequence or video footage, and I can go open. Now you'll notice in that process that if I hit R again and bring that up, if I untick sequence, you will see the entire sequence of images in the list here. But as soon as I tick sequence, I actually get the whole sequence summed up in one line, and it says 0 to 153, and I can go OK. I can even have a look at the footage before I bring it in and go OK, and there it is there. So these 3 are actually read nodes, and I can bring up their various settings up in here by double clicking, and it brings up their settings in the properties pane. These ones are a little different. These ones are actually part of Nuke. You'll see up here in the image menu that we have constant, checkerboard, color bars, color wheel, and there's a couple of others hidden in the menus as well that are they're predetermined nodes that can really be helpful in the process. Now I've got a checkerboard. This color wheel is very helpful, and it also has its own alpha channel as well. I've got the color bars, which are also very, very helpful. There's a bunch of these sorts of things that we use quite often, and I'll be showing you that in some real world examples coming up. So what I'm going to do is add a couple of nodes to show you how we do that. So let's take our color bars here. I'm going to add a blur node to this, and I can do that in a number of ways. And the easiest way, and the way I use the most, is using the tab system. If I click on tab, it brings up this little thing, hit B, L, and you'll notice it's at the top of the list, and there's my blur node. And because I had the color bars selected, it stuck the blur node underneath, and it automatically piped this arrow directly into the blur node. So if I wind that up, I now have blur going on there. Now, if I delete that blur node and I select nothing here in the node graph and just click on an empty space, and if I use that same tab and B for blur and click, notice it's not automatically piped into the color bars. I have to connect it in, and then I can connect my viewer to it. And also, if I do that again, just go blur, what I can actually do is drag this onto the pipe that already exists with the color bars down to the viewer, and it will pop it into that hierarchy. So let me just make sure we're looking at the right thing. So I can blur that up. Now, say for instance I want to do a saturation as well. I can go tab, sat, and then bring it up. And then you'll notice that when I create it, I actually get the properties of it over here in my properties tab. So I can saturate it down, and now it's blurring, and then it's saturating, and it's viewing everything down that pipe. Now if I highlight the viewer node, notice that the arrows are highlighted and it's showing me what is being processed down that pipe. Now I will refer to these as pipes, and I will refer to this direction as downstream and upstream. So if you hear me saying that, then that's basically what I'm referring to. Now if you want to deselect or if you want to switch off, a node so that you can see the product without that node active, just use the hotkey D, and what it does is it deactivates the node. So D I use a lot. In fact, it's probably the key I use the most, because you're constantly referring to the image with and without the effect that you're working on. So the blur, I could highlight it and hit D to disable, and then D again to enable. So I use that quite a bit. Now I can highlight this and delete, and I can also drag my marquee around it and delete. Now notice if I only drag over half of the node, it's not selecting. You have to drag over the entire node for it to select. So I could drag over the entire bottom node, but the top node won't select. But if I go all the way over both, then it will select. So be aware of that you do have to select the entire node using the marquee tool in order to select it. So with that blur node deleted, I'm just going to drop in here and show you a couple of things that are interesting about these nodes. Have a look at the little tiny icons that are available here. Notice there's a red, green, blue, and white icon, but on this one there's no white icon. And the reason for that is that these indicate the channels that exist on, like if I bring up this one, there's a red, green, and blue channel, but there's no alpha channel. And sure enough, if we select our channels up here, there is no alpha channel. So I'll go back to RGB. This one over here, there is an alpha channel, and if I go up into here, there's the alpha channel that it's indicating. So these little tiny indicators are fantastic. Now have a look if I put a blur node on this color wheel. Notice the little icons are little tiny square icons, and the reason they are is that these indicate that nothing is being done to the image by this node. As soon as I bring up the size, have a look at those icons, they jump up, and that means, that indicates in the node graph that this blur node is doing something to those channels. Have a look now if I just delete that blur node and maybe put in a saturation node, and notice once again we've got these little tiny squares. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring the saturation down only on the red channel. So you'll notice there that I'm dropping the saturation out of the red channel, and a little bit too far. And see here that it's indicated with only the red channel is being manipulated. The others are still these little tiny squares, which mean they aren't being manipulated. Bring this across a little bit and go blue. Now it's the red and the blue channel that are being desaturated. And if I click this one, then it's red, green, and blue. Now the alpha channel is not being desaturated because the saturation node, this one here, is not set to recognize the alpha channel up here where it says channels. It's only set to recognize red, green, and blue. Okay, so this is all important stuff, but really we haven't seen how we can actually layer image or image elements over the top of other elements. And this is the very basis or at the heart of compositing, is the ability to layer these things over one another. Now, we try not to confuse the process by referring to layering. That's simply because that's not the architecture that Nuke is formed on. So what we do is this is an A over B process. It's a merge process, and let me explain what that means. I'm going to take this color wheel and this checkerboard, and we'll drag them over here. I'll take the viewer over with us just so that we can sort of keep these isolated while we work. And what I want to do is I want to put the color wheel over the top of the checkerboard. Now we know the color wheel has an alpha channel. and there it is there. So we should be able to put this over the top of it. This is what we do to get these layered over one another. We just hit tab to bring up my tab menu, hit M-E-R-G-E, merge. And by default, it's set to over, and I'll get to what that means shortly. And I'm going to pipe the B pipe into the checkerboard. I'm going to pipe the A pipe into the color wheel, and then I'm going to put the viewer onto the merge. And you'll see that we now have our color wheel over the top of our checkerboard. Now watch what happens if I swap those around and actually put the color wheel as the B and the checkerboard as the A. The way Nuke works is it always makes the B pipe of any merge operation the dominant pipe. And so it'll always be A over B. And if I swap them back again and put the checkerboard as B and the color wheel as A, then A will always go over B. Now, I mentioned before that by default this is set to over, and if I double click on it, I can bring up the merge settings up in here. This is the operation, it's set to over. Now I'm just going to hold my my mouse on there, and you can see all of the different operations that are available. If I click here, you'll see that there's a big list of them. I might even just pull this off so we can drag it down here and bring that list up. So these are all of the operations that I can use for that merge, and at the moment it's over. Now if I hold my cursor on it, notice every single one of them is A plus B, A minus B, A divided by B, and that's because A is always the first part of the equation, and it will always be the first part of the equation. I can, if I just dock this, or just delete it and then double click to bring it back up again, I can swap these around and put the color wheel as B and the checkerboard as A, but instead of over, I can put it as under. And it's the same thing. But this is not a very good practice, because watch what happens if I hide or switch off this merge. It always leaves me with the B pipe. If you switch off a merge by using the D toggle, it will always leave you with the B pipe. Now the B pipe, if this was a background image, it's getting rid of the background image, it's getting rid of all of the other merges that have made up that background image, and it's only leaving me with this foreground element. So this is probably just, this could be a text element, it could be just some mask or something like that, and it's because it's on the B pipe, that's the one that it's going to leave me with in the viewer, not the checkerboard. So using this under process, you've really got to be careful at using these sorts of things to fool the process into doing something in reverse. The proper way to do it is to always make sure that the B pipe is maintained throughout your stream. So this should be an over. And now if I hide the merge using the D, it's going to maintain the background as it should. And then come in here now, and what I might do is I might just get this color bars, and I'm going to bring up a transform, and that allows me, and if I just have a look at what's going on here, and I'm just going to scale this up like this, and what I can do is use another merge, and the hotkey is M for merge, by the way, and pipe the original work that I did, and then have these color bars as my transform, as my A pipe. And you'll see now that I have these color bars over this merge, and if I hide it or disable it, it gives me this, and if I disable this, it gives me that, and so on. So what I'm doing is maintaining this. So the best way to look at it, and I do this, and I'm going to show you lots of tricks like this, I try to represent this in my viewport. I try to represent it so that it shows me an A over B dominance in my script. So if I switch those on again, So you can see here that my B pipe continues down through here, and my A pipe is going in as it's moving down. Just one last thing that I'll have a look at, and like I said, we've skipped over a lot of things, and that is deliberate. It's not accidental. It's because we're going to be covering a lot of this stuff over the next 9 lessons. So don't panic. We're going to cover quite a lot of the stuff that you think we may have skipped over. The last couple of things I want to have a look at, just housekeeping nodes. The first one is a dot. It's a dot node, and if I bring up my tab and just type in dot, this is all it is. And what it allows me to do is I can have this up here. I can put the dot node here and then get a right angle out of it. Now, this may seem anal and overkill for such a simple script, but trust me, there's going to be a lot more nodes going on, and keeping your nodes clean and keeping your scripts clean is crucial to making sure that you can understand them and making sure that other artists can understand them as well. So the dot node I use quite a lot. Another one I use quite a bit is a backdrop node. If I just type in backdrop, this is a backdrop node, and if I just drag it up here, pull it out a little bit, literally it is a background. You can see the purplish color one that I used over here. If I double click on it to bring up its properties, I can click up here and change the color to whatever I want. And I can also type in a label here, and let's go color wheel, and highlight it, and then just wind up the text size. I can change the text color if I wanted. I can even change the font. But what I use this for is I can actually drag it over underneath something like this, and now what happens if I drag that backdrop, those nodes go with it. It doesn't mean that I can't change my position of my nodes. I can move these around independently, and I can actually move them off as well. But these backdrops make the organizing of your scripts really easy. I use them all the time. Another one I use is a sticky note. And just quickly on those backdrops, if you highlight some nodes and then you hit backdrop through the tab bar, it will create a backdrop perfectly underneath those nodes. So I use that quite a lot as well. Another one I use quite a lot is a sticky note. And a sticky note literally is a way for you to, and I'll just bump up the size of this one here. It's a way for you to use notes to remind yourself and or other artists of certain things that are happening in your script. Sticky notes are very important for staying organized and for passing information to other artists. And the last one that I use quite a bit, and I'm going to be using in the next couple of lessons, is a no-op. And I'll just go into a no-op node, and literally a no-op node is a way for you to store expressions. You can use it to put a postage stamp in the middle of a script to help stay organized as well. So there's a number of things that we can use a no-op for, but basically it really has no functionality out of the box, but you can drive quite a lot in through that process as well, and I'm going to be explaining that in future lessons. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is not a definitive look at Nuke and its interface and tools, but I did want to take the time to just go through the interface to such a degree that you are going to be able to do the next 9 lessons without being totally lost and without forcing you to go and do an introduction to Nuke tutorial over at the Foundry. So rest assured, you don't need to go and do that if you've sat through this tutorial, and you're going to have enough knowledge to now go forward. As I start to refer to various things in Nuke over the coming lessons, you're going to be able to understand where I'm coming from. And I'm going to explore a lot of these things in a lot more detail over the coming lessons as well. So this session was a little bit less hands-on and a little bit more theory-based, but I think it was important to cover these things in order to make sure that the coming lessons aren't so foreign to you. So I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to the next lesson. What we're going to be covering in the next lesson is some multi-pass compositing. I've got some CG renders, and we're going to study a little bit of multi-pass compositing and have a look at the various ways to composite a multi-pass render out of a 3D application. And we're also going to have a look a little bit more detail at channels and how to get the best out of channels in Nuke. And clearly one of the strongest areas or most powerful areas of Nuke is the way it treats channels. So that's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.